After America is made on the lands of the Bunurong and Wurundjeri Woiwurrung peoples of the Kulin Nations, we pay our respects to elders past and present and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded.
We are in a battle for the soul of America.
This is a fraud on the American public.
When the United States and Israel began their war on Iran back in February, Donald Trump clearly wanted a quick victory, or at least the appearance of one. But what he's got is a drawn-out conflict that's cost thousands of lives, along with the most severe oil supply shock in history. That was entirely predictable, because, as it turns out, governing is not a game show.
After 2 years of negotiations, the United States, together with our international partners, has achieved something that decades of animosity has not. A comprehensive long-term deal with Iran that will prevent it from obtaining a nuclear weapon. This deal demonstrates that American diplomacy can bring about real and meaningful change. Change that makes our country and the world safer and more secure.
That's what I do. Never, ever, ever in my life have I seen any transaction so incompetently negotiated as our deal with Iran. They take our money, they make us look like fools, and now they're back to being who they really are. We are led by very, very stupid people.
In 2016, Donald Trump rode a wave of white backlash into the White House. His election bid was built around a promise to tear down everything that the first black president had done. That included the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA, a deal that the Obama administration reached with the Iranian regime and several other countries in 2015. In exchange for sanctions relief, Iran had agreed to dismantle much of its nuclear program and opened its facilities to more extensive international inspections. But Trump tore up the JCPOA in 2018. Now he's trying to bomb his way to a better outcome, and it's failing spectacularly. Not only that, but 2 weeks ago, the President of the United States threatened to commit genocide in Iran. The use of nuclear weapons was implicit in his statement that a whole civilization will die tonight. Even though he didn't follow through, at least this time, Trump is breaking down the guardrails around the development and use of nuclear weapons, the very thing the JCPOA was helping to prevent. Returning to the show this week is John B. Wolfsthal. He's the US Nuclear Policy Fellow at Pax Sapiens and member of the Science and Security Board of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. John was part of the team that negotiated the Iran nuclear deal in 2015. He served as Special Assistant to President Obama for National Security Affairs and is a former Senior Director at the National Security Council for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation. He also served as Special Advisor to Vice President Biden for Nuclear Security and Non-Proliferation.
John, yikes. The last time we spoke to you, things were not great, and they have gotten, I think it's fair to say, considerably worse in the meantime. How are you?
I'm good. I'm safe. I'm healthy. I appreciate what I have, but it's you led in correctly. Yikes is a great way of leading in. These are unprecedented times here in the United States, and I know people around the world are watching and wondering what is happening, what's going to happen next. You're not alone. We're in the same place.
Yeah. And I mean, the reality is, of course, that nobody really knows the answer to that question, including the President of the United States. Let's start with all these unprecedented happenings. Reporting recently has suggested that President Trump has said that talks with Iran might resume in the next couple of days. You know, he loves giving these loose timelines. What do you make broadly of the Trump administration's diplomacy when it comes to Iran?
Yeah, it really is striking that the public discourse, and some people would say the coarse discourse that we've seen by the president, the end of civilization, and seems to be much worse than what's happening behind the scenes. We've seen the Pakistani Army Chief of Staff meet with the Speaker of the Iranian Parliament, who clearly has significant influence in the government that hasn't been assassinated. There have been reporting here in the United States that, in fact, the United States and Iran were not that far away on the broad outlines of a deal before the bombing started 6 weeks ago, where Iran had offered to suspend enrichment for 5 years, and the Trump administration knows it has to be 20. Well, I'm a professional negotiator. I can figure out where that's going to end up about.
Mm-hmm.
But it's with President Trump, it's clear that he can't always get out of his own way. He believes that he can quickly negotiate a deal, that it should be easy, when in fact agreements take time. There are a lot of details that have to be worked out. So we don't know if we're going to get from here to a deal that people will be comfortable with, but at least there is ongoing diplomacy behind the scenes. And I think that's driven largely by the reality that even though the United States and Iran have very difficult, problematic relations now dating back 60 years, the war has affected everybody. Oil prices, large global supply chains, the loss of life in and around the Gulf. All of these things have global implications, and the United States and Iran are no longer the only actors here.
Yeah. And I think you're right to point that out, because it is a pretty complicated mess. And I mean, I guess it's heartening to know that there is more diplomacy going on behind the scenes than it first seems. But that kind of diplomacy, as you say, is really hard. And even in the hypothetical situation that we're dealing with, all of a sudden dealing with a capable administration, given that mess, those negotiations are incredibly difficult. So, I mean, if you are the one in the room working with a capable administration, where do you start? How do you engage in that process?
Well, negotiations, this goes back to graduate school level stuff, which is just, what are you trying to achieve? What is your outcome? What are your goals? I don't think President Trump really knew what his goals were at the start of the war. There's a lot of good reporting that suggests he was convinced by Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu that he could topple the regime in Iran, that they were ready to go after the protests and the murder of reportedly tens of thousands of Iranian citizens, that they would rise up. I think he clearly now recognizes that Bibi, who has preached regime change for now multiple decades, was wrong. I think that has created some significant distance between President Trump and President Netanyahu. And you've seen now the United States put pressure on Israel to negotiate a ceasefire in Lebanon, and that appears to be coming to pass, although whether that will include Hezbollah and the proxies, we don't know. We saw regime change, we saw nuclear, we saw military capabilities, we saw the ability to control the Straits of Hormuz, all as justifications for the war. President Trump seems to have now focused in on the nuclear question. He's said, well, the regime has changed. They haven't really, in fact, if anything, they've gotten more conservative, but he has killed, or Israel has killed, the leadership, so the people are different. Instead of the father, it's the son. And by many reports, the IRGC has seized greater control of the government. So it can be argued that it's more conservative now. But if the focus is now on the nuclear question, then I think there are really two fundamental challenges. What is an agreement that the United States is prepared to accept as a reasonable settlement? Is that suspension of enrichment for a period of time? Are that certain controls on their nuclear capability, which can be negotiated? Iran has indicated they're willing to do that. And what is the United States prepared to give Iran as an incentive to achieve that outcome? That's, I think, basic trade space, and I could come up with 5 different solutions that would work for me personally. But I think then there's this other element, and I'm biased. I admit that I'm biased. I worked on the Iran deal that President Obama negotiated. President Trump is going to have to explain how and why the deal he negotiates, if he can, is better, because he said he would get a better deal. And Republicans and Democrats who voted against the Iran nuclear deal will have to explain why it's different this time. It's no longer a question of whether the deal is a good one. It's whether or not the deal is as good or better than the one that we had in place 11 years ago. And whether that now justifies the United States giving Iran, which will have to be billions of dollars in sanctions relief and Iranian frozen assets. So that trade space, I think, is evolving. I don't think anybody has confidence that President Trump has defined red lines that, nobody knows when and how he'll compromise. But the negotiating record so far is that President Trump will fold. The joke here is taco. Sort of take action and chicken out. And so, I think there's good reason to believe the Iranians think that they can hold out longer, that they can withstand more pain than the United States can, that eventually the United States will come around. And I don't think anybody knows whether that's true or not.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I'm really interested that you brought up this idea of taco because, of course, this comes up all the time, that Trump is escalating in order to de-escalate, that he's using the Richard Nixon madman theory. But I mean, my take on that is that only really works if you've got a strategy. If you know, as you were saying before, if you know what your end game is. And it seems as though because Trump doesn't have that, he doesn't know what that is, he's stuck himself in an escalatory trap where the only way to go is to keep escalating the threats, which then undermines your ability to negotiate a complex resolution. Do you think that's a fair assessment?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fair. I would put it in a slightly different way, which is you can play the madman theory once, maybe twice, but once you establish a pattern that you act tough, you are belligerent, you escalate, and then you back down and accept terms short of what you initially indicated, then, people begin to play you. Pick your game, right? Poker, chess, whatever it happens to be. I don't know if you can do it in Mahjong or not. That eventually the Iranians are going to say, you know what? We want this more than he does. Our timeline is longer than his, and we can force him to fold. And in negotiation after negotiation, that has been the pattern. And so I think as a negotiator, you also look at what is it your negotiating partner, or in this case, your adversary, wants. Is Iran in an untenable position right now? I don't think they are. Right now, they control the Straits of Hormuz, which is something that they've wanted for decades. The price of oil has gone up by 50%. They continue to sell oil. They continue to sell oil futures. And so they are bringing in revenue over and above what they were before the conflict started. And the IRGC, which controls, by some estimates, 60 to 70% of the Iranian economy, has consolidated control. They have less power sharing with the Islamic fundamentalist religious organizations, and you basically have much more of a military junta or military control in Iran. So can they last 6 months or a year in this environment? I think by most people's estimates, they could. Can President Trump politically last a year where oil is over $100 a barrel, where gas in the United States, I think it's probably low by Australian comparisons, but gas has now gone to over $4 a gallon in the United States. It was below $3 a gallon 3 or 4 months ago. And the debate in the United States is not about whether the war is good or the war is bad. It's about affordability. It's about inflation. It's about the cost of food and housing and transport. And so I think Iran probably believes that they can outlast President Trump. And so that gets to your point about escalation. Trump may believe that he can force Iran to back down and may be tempted to further escalate. He has some voices in his administration that probably would agree with him, and nobody really knows how far that will go. And I think this is one aspect that we haven't yet confronted in this conflict. I think everything Iran has done, from my perspective, has been predictable. They have done exactly what we had gamed out in the Obama administration and inside of Biden, that they would lash out against the Gulf states, that they would constrain the flow of oil, that they would activate their proxies. The fact that the Trump administration didn't predict that or didn't believe that is to their negligence and to our negative. But at some point, things are going to happen that nobody wants and that nobody expects. Things are going to escalate out of control because that's what happens in a conflict. And at that point, I think we face tremendous risk about this conflict spreading even further, and the consequences hitting not just the rest of the world, but coming home to the United States physically. And I think that's what the shoe that is yet to drop is the fear that Iran has and has maintained for many decades, sleeper cells and the ability to take physical action through terrorism and other steps around the world, including the United States. And if that happens, I really worry for how this conflict could metastasize.
Yeah, it is incredibly
You
worrying.
didn't call me to be cheered up. You called me for my assessment of what's happening, and it's not good news.
No, it's really not good news. And I mean, actually, part of the reason that we called you and asked you to come back was because of your expertise in this area, and particularly because of, speaking of escalation and the extreme risk of this spiraling out of control, the President of the United States did threaten to commit genocide. He made a post threatening to end a civilization. And, of course, he didn't do that. But I am really interested to hear, what you make of all that, given what we've just talked about in terms of the risk, but also, Trump backing down. And also, I guess, just to add to that, the idea that, this was also a threat. I think it was a threat to use nuclear weapons, because how do you obliterate a civilization overnight, never to return? Not with conventional weapons, generally speaking. So I'm aware that's a very big question, John, but I'll just throw to you. What did you make of all of that?
So I have been worried for some time, dating back to the first Trump administration, that the norm against the use of nuclear weapons and the barriers to presidential nuclear use under President Trump were not durable.
The United States has great strength and patience, but if it is forced to defend itself or its allies, we will have no choice but to totally destroy North Korea. Rocket Man is on a suicide mission for himself and for his regime.
He said, I have a red button on my desk. I said, I have a red button also, but mine's bigger than yours and mine works.
You'll find out very soon, but we're going to do some testing. Yeah, other countries do it. If they're going to do it, we're going to do it.
Okay, you can't clarify whether you feel received.
I'm not going to say yet. I know exactly what we're doing, where we're doing it, but other countries are doing it, and if other countries do it, we do it.
I think it makes nuclear conflict less likely, and America will ensure that we have the strongest, most capable nuclear arsenal so that we maintain peace through strength. That's what this is.
He has asked, we have this now reported by multiple cabinet members from his first term, well, what's the point of having nuclear weapons if I can't use them? He has threatened to use nuclear weapons in multiple cases, both against nuclear states and non-nuclear states. And there are two episodes over the last 2 months that worry me. One is, early on in the conflict, he said that we will demand Iran's unconditional surrender. For a nuclear historian like me, that immediately evokes President Truman's demands that Japan unilaterally and unconditionally surrender at the end of World War II. And when they didn't, we dropped not one but 2 nuclear weapons on Japan at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And then when he made his threats now only 2 weeks ago, I can't believe it's only 2 weeks ago, to end the civilization in Iran, which many people took as a veiled nuclear threat. I don't know whether the president thought about, understood, or was trying to indicate that he was willing and thinking about using nuclear weapons. It's possible. We don't have any reporting that that is the case. We don't have any reporting that's not the case. But there's no doubt that it raised concerns in the United States, that it raised concerns internationally, that this was what the president was indicating. That had to affect Iranian thinking about what they would do in response, and did they potentially take steps to prepare for that and or respond to it. So I think the broader dynamic is one where we have to take a step back and recognize that those laws, domestic laws in the United States, and the international law, which has been adopted by the United States and should be under our Constitution, the supreme law of the land, are no longer binding on the president. And the question could easily come up that the president wants to use a nuclear weapon and the military under him will have to decide, is that a legal order or not? Are they going to carry it out or not? All of which has horrific implications for the United States, for the future of efforts to prevent nuclear proliferation, for the threat that other countries, Russia, China, North Korea, might consider the use of nuclear weapons. We are in very dangerous territory here. And it comes back to the fact that this is a war of choice. It is a crisis and a conflict and a risk that was created by President Trump and President Trump alone. And the rest of us are dealing with the consequences there. Now, my personal view, having worked with many people in strategic command and in the military for many decades, is that they would not carry out a threat to use nuclear weapons against Iran. That the president would say, if I want to destroy this target with a nuclear weapon, they would say, Mr. President, that is illegal. We have other ways we can destroy that target. There are conventional weapons. We can destroy that bridge. We can destroy that bunker. And that is, in fact, the way we teach our military to operate. He could fire them and find somebody else, or he could back down. And we don't know the answer. We hope that we don't have to go there. But that risk, I think, is with us. And it's one that we're working through day by day.
Yeah, and I mean, it's one that I guess advocates of non-proliferation have always made, that those risks are always there, regardless of who's in charge. It's just that Trump, really highlights them, I guess.
Yeah, it's not to get into nuclear theology for an audience that probably doesn't care about nuclear theology, but
I think they get.
President Trump is not the first U.S. president that has had subordinates worried about his judgment. Under Richard Nixon, who was drinking heavily and using drugs at the end of his administration, there was concern that he might order a nuclear strike before he was forced to resign. Reportedly, his subordinates made clear that any nuclear order should be checked with them before it was executed. So this is not the first time we've dealt with this. In the past, we advocates for nuclear restraint have been reassured by the military that they have procedures in place to ensure that the laws will be followed and that nuclear use will not be possible if it is in violation of the Constitution and domestic law. Now, however, we have legal opinions that have been put forward by both the White House and the Department of Justice and by the Department of Defense that basically say the president and as commander-in-chief can ignore international law, is not bound by treaties, and can execute whatever orders he believes are necessary to protect and defend the United States of America. Does everybody feel that way? We don't know. Will all military officers say, oh, well, you've got a lawyer who said it's okay, I'm going to go ahead and follow that? I don't believe that's the case. But we are, in many ways, in unprecedented territory here, and we are being tested. And it does get to the question of, as long as you have nuclear weapons, there's always a risk that they will be used. For deterrence to work, that has to be in place. But the norms, the laws, and procedures that are in place are clearly inadequate to reassure the American public that those safeties are durable. And that's one of the challenges that I think we're going to face if we survive through the next 2.5 to 3 years. What is the next Congress? What is the next president going to do to reassure Americans that, in fact, our constitutional norms are durable?
Yeah. I want to come back to that question of domestic law and guardrails and international law as well, in fact. But I guess just before we do, your description there of what's happening in the Pentagon, in the White House, as the possibility that the president will give this order, I think is very accurate. And as this was all happening, I was also thinking pretty hard about what might be happening in, the office of the Australian Prime Minister, for example, how they're scrambling to work out what they would do if the president does give this order. I mean, particularly because from the Australian perspective, we are deeply involved through joint facilities in Pine Gap. So this would have significant implications for Australia as well. What do you think allies can do in that situation? Who can they call? What phone calls are they making? What leverage do they have in strong friendships with the United States to, I guess, avoid that potential outcome?
It's a really good question. And, I think there is no one-size-fits-all answer here. President Trump has lashed out at some very close allies, and he has embraced states that are enemies of the United States, antithetical to American and allied interests. Australia has actually been one of the countries that's navigated the relationship quite well. Of course, Italy had done quite well until recently, until the president insulted the Pope. And then, of course, the Italian prime minister is going to choose the Pope. That's not hard to figure out.
Why did you attack Pope Leo on Truth Social?
I don't think he's doing a very good job. He likes crime, I guess.
But for allies in Canada, in Denmark, in Australia, in the United Kingdom that do have facilities that are integral to U.S. nuclear command and control, I do think there is a role to play here in terms of communicating. And already a number of countries have done this when it came to President Trump's request/demand that allies help reopen the Straits of Hormuz. I think the fact that states said, no, we're not going to do that. We weren't involved in the decision making. We are not going to expose our troops and our men and women and our facilities to attack. We're not going to allow this war to spin out of control. I think that in itself sent a message that President Trump knows he is far more isolated than he believed he would be. But I do think the military to military communication is critical here, which is that countries are bound not to contribute to a violation of international law. Australia cannot actively participate in something that is a violation of international humanitarian law or customary international law under the Geneva Conventions. And I think there's a role for both the legal communities in the military, and I think if necessary at the diplomatic community to say, we cannot participate in that, we will not participate in that, and we will view that action as a fundamental challenge to our ability to cooperate in the future. Will that have an impact on the Trump administration? I don't know. It would clearly resonate with normal professionals in the Pentagon, with trained and responsible Foreign Service officers. But I don't know that it will have any impact on President Trump. But I don't think you can, let's say, I'll be careful here because it's not for you to tell us how to live and for us to tell you how to live. But I don't think you should worry about whether or not it will have the right outcome. There's right and wrong. And so, if you believe that those actions would violate international law and you're committed to the rule of law, then there's a responsibility to speak up and have those views made clear.
Yeah, I mean, for what it's worth, I couldn't agree more that it's incumbent on an Australian government that says it cares about the international rules-based order to make that clear. And I mean, that perhaps leads me to my last question, John. In that context, we spoke, or you spoke about the legal barriers or lack thereof domestically and internationally to giving those kinds of orders. Do you think there are avenues to rebuilding those barriers, rebuilding international law, especially when it comes to the use of nuclear weapons, while the Trump administration is still there?
So I do. I don't think they're bound to be wildly successful, but there is some feeling here based on polling and the lack of popularity behind this war and how the public has turned against President Trump, that at least one of our two houses of Congress will flip from Republican to Democratic control, and potentially even both houses of Congress. That will be an opportunity to reset the narrative around executive power and congressional power. Not because Congress will all of a sudden decide, you know what, we want to exercise our power under the Constitution, but because of just raw hard politics, right? And this has worked both ways. Republican Congresses have always wanted to work against, or not always, but have recently turned against Democratic presidents, and I would expect more of the same if things were to switch the other way. But it is in those periods that the expectations for what will happen under a new administration get set. And so if a democratically controlled Congress believes that a president should not be able to go to war without congressional authorization, that war operations should not be funded without the Congress actually voting for them. And right now we have the president basically just redirecting funding as he sees fit in violation of the Constitution in order to pay for these operations. That will set the bar. And so I do think there is a possibility that a future Congress will say the use of nuclear weapons can only take place consistent with the Constitution, a U.S. declaration of war under the Constitution, and that the president is bound by international treaties adopted through a constitutional process that becomes supreme law of the land. President Trump would veto that, but there is still then the ability for the Congress to go to the Congress and say, we have passed these laws. They could try to override his veto. And assuming we have another president at some point, that president might then say, you know what, I'm going to sign that law because we do need to rebalance. Those are all a lot of ifs, right? I mean, if a frog had wings, it wouldn't bump its butt when it hopped. So, the if is doing a lot of work there. But I think we have to shoot for what we believe to be right. And this is not, I don't believe this should be a partisan political issue. Most people in the United States would say, we want the Constitution to be respected. And the Constitution says if a treaty is adopted, it is the supreme law of the land. That shouldn't be a political debate. Under President Trump, it is. My hope is that we will reset that conversation.
John, it is wildly out of character for us to end on a somewhat optimistic note, but I think we should do it.
I don't want to break with precedent, but yeah.
These are unprecedented times, as we've discussed.
There you go.
So,
Well done.
John, thank you so much for your time and your generosity in such unprecedented times. I cannot tell you how much we appreciate it.
My pleasure, Emma. Thanks for having me. I wish you well.
And you.
Thanks so much for joining us for this week's episode. The latest Vantage Point essay from Australia Institute Press is available for pre-order now. In Rich Kid, Poor Kid, The Battle for Public Education, best-selling author and Walkley Award-winning journalist Jane Caro examines the origins of Australia's public education crisis. In the essay, Caro lays bare decades of poor policy choices and outlines what governments can do to create the public education system Australians deserve. Available for $19.95, Pod listeners can get free shipping by using the code PODVP, that's PODVP, at checkout. Visit australiainstitute.org.au/store to pre-order now. And we'd love to hear your thoughts on the show. You can reach us via our email address, which is podcasts@australiainstitute.org.au. This episode was recorded on Friday, the 17th of April, Australian time. After America is supported by the Andrew Farron Foundation and produced by Angus Blackman. We'll be back next week. I'm Emma Shortis. Thanks for listening.